She'd writhed and begged. She'd said the things ladies only did in his fantasies, but out loud. He'd have to tell his closest mate, Callum, about this tomorrow, he thought. The stablemaster's boy was a year or two younger than he, but they had spent years romping about Wester Ross and galloping their horses over Gresham Peak to the freedom of the Airedale moors. Lately, they'd taken to pinching a bit of fragrant tobacco from Callum's father's tin and smoking it behind the Rosses' cattle pastures. They'd watch the waves bash against the black cliffs and laugh at the antics of fluffy red Highland calves, while speculating at length on just this very thing. What a naked woman looked like, what she'd feel like, what they someday wanted to do to her, or what they hoped she'd do to them. They'd spy on Mrs. Ross, a pretty, young, dark-haired lass with sparkling blue eyes and a way to her walk that endlessly enticed them both. She was a strong and shapely woman, with a laugh that carried over the moors and drew answering smiles from the boys. Though she was a cattle rancher's wife, she always dressed like a fine lady. On a particularly sunny day, they'd peeked over one of the craggy stones at the base of Gresham Peak in open-mouthed stupefaction, as James Ross had tupped his pretty wife against the barn in front of God and all the cattle. With her dress on and everything, much to the disappointment of the boys, as the particulars of the act had been hidden in endless petticoats. The entire affair had been fast and loud, and the couple had sighed and laughed afterward. "I could marry a woman like that," Callum announced in his brash Irish brogue. "Aye," Thorne had readily agreed, though he wasn't so sure. Maybe he wanted a woman more like his own mother, soft-spoken, elegant, and unfailingly kind. Mrs. Ross sometimes yelled at her husband, and once they'd seen her throw a shoe at him. Hit him right in the arse. What kind of woman did something like that? His mother would never. His father would certainly kill her if she so much as raised her voice to him, let alone her shoe. God, but he despised his father, almost as much as he feared him. Why couldn't he have been born to people like the Rosses? Simple, happy people. Wealthy in land and holdings, or so he heard tell, but not noble in the least. They lived in their own verdant kingdom, one Thorne visited as often as he could escape his own. Well, the next time he and Callum slipped away, he'd get to boast that he'd become a man this night, that he'd done all the things they'd held in the scope of their boyish conjecture, and other things besides. Sometimes he hated Callum, envied him his gruff but fair and kind father, and endless days of freedom to hunt and haver like a bloody savage. Thorne had been an earl since his 7th year, as his mother's uncle had died, and he'd been the next male heir in the St. James line. Inverthorne Keep to the north belonged to him now, though his father claimed it in trust and held it as his troth. Thorne's title meant nothing to him. He was only glad to be clever, that he'd a wit for words, as he'd lock away every detail of his experience with Tessa McGrath to describe in graphic, envy-inducing detail on the morn. That was the last thought he'd spare for Callum until much, much later. Who could focus on aught but the encompassing sight of the willing lass splayed before him? Then the laird produced the whip, and Thorne's anticipation and arousal withered like a salted snail. Hamish's favourite instrument of pain and terror had been a Mackenzie acquisition from the Roman era. Legend had it one of their Pictish ancestors had ripped it out of the hands of a legionnaire and beaten him to death with it. Thorne didn't know if the story was true, but he knew the pain of its kiss, and missed the flesh it had torn from his back upon occasion. A desperate "no" tripped from his lips as the laird ran the whip over the purring whore's back. She'd arched and gasped in anticipation, until the first 2 lashes had bit into her own perfect flesh. Thorne shrank away, as his father stalked to their side of the bed and held the detested whip's pommel out to his sons. 2 lashes from each of you, he'd ordered. "She'll not survive that," Thorne had protested against his better judgment.